Hi everyone, welcome to another More Than Just Storytellers video where we're showcasing the immense skills and abilities that people with lived experience bring to their work in suicide prevention. I sat down with Hope Carberry, who uses her lived experience to support others going through suicide bereavement, and her story is incredible. And she calls on us to think of lived experience as more than just a performance and more as a way to transform our suicide prevention work and the way that we relate to other people. But no more from me. I'll leave it up to her to tell you the rest of her story.
So Hope, this campaign is all about showcasing the immense skills and talents that people with lived experience bring to their work in suicide prevention, and to demonstrate that people with lived experience aren't defined by their lived experience and their story of suicide loss or suicidality or caring for someone who's suicidal or whatever else they define as their lived experience. It's not all that they have to contribute to suicide prevention. So, what rings true for you about this campaign? Can you just tell me a little bit about why you wanted to participate?
Yeah, for me, I I want to be seen more as the person who has lost a lot of people to suicide. That's so for me. I have a lived experience of suicide bereavement, and I work in a field where I'm a lived experience worker, and my primary qualification is that I've had people die, but it that isn't that's technically my qualification, but for me, it's so much more. Like, I've had this unfortunate experience in my life, and the ability that we have to be able to translate what those experiences looked like and how we were able to work through, or sometimes not work through, the immense complex change in our lives and the change in our identities, and support people who are going through those same experiences, just to bring normalization and understanding to a really complex and confusing, sad part of their lives. And it's much more than people dying in our lives. It's much more. I completely understand that not everyone who has been through this would be able to translate that experience into bringing it into the workplace. And I think that that bridge in between those sad experiences and being able to utilize them, that bridge in between, is something that's not often recognized as a completely defined and important set of skills. And they're hard, and we have to develop them naturally. There isn't a training course on how to translate suicide loss into the workplace. We need to sort of figure it out.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really important to talk about that because, like, I speak to a lot of people, obviously at work, but also outside of work, who have gone through not just suicide loss, but gone through major suicide related experiences, who would like to be able to utilize that. And it's very difficult for someone to learn, for lack of better word, how to translate those skills to utilize really effectively and humanistically in a way that's not going to further traumatize yourself or someone else. Like, there are amazing courses out there, but there isn't really, from what I can see, at least in my area, like a full department of skill set training. I think it's important to talk about because we are, I think, quite often when someone goes through something like that, we can be seen as like the face of a public speaking campaign, which is important, very important. But it's there is a lot that we are able to bring into most mental health, and not even mental health, but governance frameworks, workplaces, understanding, like even just society, like just understanding what this new life looks like for a lot of people, unfortunately. And I think, yeah, getting out there, having a chat, and discussing that for me, like, I'm more than just the girl whose family has died.
Yeah, and you talk about all of those skills that are needed in the workplace alongside lived experience. In your work in bereavement peer work, what are some of those skills that you've found that you're using in the work that you do?
I think one of the more surprising things, and I think I'm not sure why this is surprising now to me, but one of the more surprising things is, like, when you enter this work as a peer worker, it's very strongly emphasized here that your lived experience is like the importance as to why you're here. And then you realize very much that your lived experience is but a drop in the water. And it's not so singular, which thank goodness, because I don't want people to have my experience. But there's so many layers that can change people's stories. Like dealing with the police, there's a wide spectrum on how that impacts people. Dealing with the coroner, same thing. Cultural influences over the stigma of suicide, whether or not your person who died had been engaged in a service prior to their death or not. There's those are just tiny little things that can really influence your story and really change. And I think for me, like, I got this job because of what I went through, but a lot of the time it's completely irrelevant. Like my actual lived experience isn't necessarily relevant to the people that I talk to, which is perfect. The biggest skill, like, whilst your lived experience is super important, so you have the understanding, like specifically in bereavement, the understanding of the challenges that lie with death to suicide and the challenges that arise with you personally. The biggest skill sets to have is the ability to listen, empathy, the ability to have empathy, the ability to sit judgment free, because people in their experience of grief and bereavement, like, people can say and think some wild things, which they're absolutely entitled to. But sometimes people will think things that are completely the polar opposite of what you believe. And for me, I think that's been one of the bigger surprises, is that it's not just your lived experience that's important. It's more, it's like how you are as a human. And I guess one of the interesting things after a suicide death is that you don't necessarily know who you are as a human when you come on the other side of a bereavement, because you completely change. Well, a lot of people do. And you don't necessarily know how you may respond to certain things until you're confronted, and that can be very interesting at times, really challenging, upsetting at times, or really normal. Yeah.
Yeah, and in what you just spoke about then, the diversity of experience, we chatted before about how different lived experiences are, even though, as you say, lived experience generally is a qualification that you need for your particular role. Do you think in the suicide prevention space, in the work that we do, there needs to be, I don't know, differences in qualifying lived experience? Or, yeah, what are your thoughts around the diversity of lived experience and how that is expressed in suicide prevention work?
I think it's really important to acknowledge the differences because we're doing a really good job, suicide prevention as a whole, of acknowledging lived experience now, which is fantastic. Um, but it's quite often like you'll go to events and they may have a lived experience speaker and they'll speak specifically about their what they went through, and it could be anything. And you will have people in the room who may be acknowledged, who may acknowledge their lived experience publicly, but you'll also have people who haven't yet had the confidence or whatever it is that they need to speak about it, who are just not publicly feeling like they're being represented or heard. I don't know. I have this analogy that I do use that's saying that you have lived experience. It's like saying you're European, and someone's from Spain and someone's from Russia. Both the same thing, but very, very different. And I think that's the thing, like even for me, like with my colleagues, we are all technically bereavement lived experience, which should sound like it's the same, but there's 5 of us at the moment in my group, and we have 5 incredibly different and diverse stories, and the paths that we all took to get to where we are today are 5 very different stories. And I think just understanding, like even in a workplace, having some kind of meeting, informal get together, what it is, however it looks like, is always going to be different, where you sit and explain the difference in your story, because it's important. Even for things like when it comes to peer matching, like for example, I have a multiple loss in my family. So with peer matching, I personally might match with someone who has a similar experience, but I may also match with someone who has lost a different relationship because our stories align in certain areas. And I think without those conversations, anything to do with suicide, not just bereavement, and small facts are very important. And small facts can be big things for some people. And I think without those really effective conversations, we're still not quite getting to the heart of the matter, where it's not just suicide or lived experience. It's so rich, so diverse, and like for me personally, I might represent sense of caring for someone who's suicidal, but without those sort of reflections and conversations to really understand what that looks like, I'm just going to be seen as a bereavement experience. And there is a lot of crossover and a lot of understanding, and also in the opposite as well.
Yeah, one of the other speakers that I spoke to on this topic of more than just storytellers, she also spoke about how the diversity of experience comes into play when it comes to supporting others, and having or knowing that you can go to someone down the road and say, oh, you've had this experience and I'm currently helping somebody through this experience, and I don't have that lived experience. And being able to share those stories and the diverse lived experiences was really important for her for, being better equipped to support others in that lived experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that's one of the important things, that where a lived experience person is seen as what we've been through isn't just a story. It's like it's an actual experience. it's not a sad story that we tell to get a call to action and, I don't know, raise money or have a small conversation in the room that evening or whatever it is that we might be trying to achieve. These are experiences that people have lived. You know, we haven't just, I mean, I wish I could write stories like this, although I think if I had a manuscript down, people would tell me to hold back. It's not realistic. um, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not just a story. It's a very rich and lived life experience that like no educational syllabus could at all understand to the full extent what we lived through, what we did to get through it, and what we learned from it, or didn't learn, what we didn't do to get through it. Like, there are both sides to that story. They're not all necessarily happy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to jump back to what you said about, you know, using a lived experience story as a call to action or to raise money. That's often the primary reason why people with lived experience are engaged in suicide prevention work. And for me, it discounts the own motivation of a person with lived experience for wanting to do suicide prevention work and forces them into a narrow role of, no, you're just for stigma busting, awareness raising, fundraising. Do you have any ideas of how we can kind of break away from that and to kind of put the person with lived experience at the center, or what is it that needs to change to shift that?
I think so. I do feel like we're doing a very good job at putting lived experience speakers in that public speaking role. But then, like, for me, it's, I personally, I enjoy it because I'm a bit of a show off. But I feel very uncomfortable at the end when people approach me and they're like, "You're so brave." That's not the purpose, and I get very, very uncomfortable. For me, I don't want to be seen differently, like brave or, you know, strong. What I think that we need to start really seeing in an effective way is, like, we're invited to sit at a lot of tables. The chairs are there for lived experience workers, or people with lived experience. There's a lot of organisations that are doing a very, very good job at including people with lived experience now. I think what we need is to start moving the voice from the stage into these tables. So it's less of a performance and more of an incredibly important, essential, and included conversation. Because I think, like, for me, I do sometimes worry that, because I think when I'm on stage, I do like telling that story to people because I can see that I'm getting a response, but I would tell it very differently within a group of people, in a workplace, on a board, in a LEAG, in a training session, and it would be less performative and more informative. And I think that's what's really important, because I think it's sometimes when it comes off as a little bit of a performance, there can feel like a bit of a veil. Like, is this exactly that lived experience? Is that really the learnings you got from that? I think those very real, honest conversations that come alongside with, you know, those amazing people who are very good at governance and framework. Like, there's some very smart people in the sector, and being able to hold your own alongside those people is where we need to be now. And to be able to translate our lived experience into real, open, honest, educational conversations. Yeah.
And in your work, I'm assuming you work with people who don't have lived experience. It's not an entirely lived experience run organization. How do you find that dynamic of working with somebody who doesn't have lived experience, and what are some of the challenges or strengths of that?
Um, it's 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 interesting at times. I'm really lucky. The people without lived experience that I work with on a daily basis are very amazing people, and they're very open to discussion about anything, really. And I went through a bereavement whilst working in this organisation. So my brother took his life to suicide, and at first, I felt there was like they're amazing, and they absolutely surrounded me with a lot of love and care, and I also felt like they were very much acting like a bit of a safety barrier between me and the job, which in hindsight was probably the right thing. Um, but I I want to be responsible for my choices in life, and I want to be responsible for making the wrong choices. If I choose to use my lived experience, regardless of whether it's recent or not, in my work, then that's my choice and my mistake to make. And I'm really lucky that I personally was able to have a conversation with my colleagues basically to that extent. And we just worked out effective communication that I was to have if it got too much for me. I do see in some workplaces that risk aversion can certainly govern a lot of people's workloads. And I would personally be a little bit concerned if someone had my experience in a different workplace, how the risk aversion behaviours might dictate that person's re-entry or workload into the workplace. And I think one of the more important things that I want people with not lived experience to understand is like we might have lived experience of something to do with suicide, but at the end of the day, everyone's carrying a load. We just have ours identified. Everyone's carrying something, particularly in suicide prevention. I would say that you will at some point get some sort of lived experience adjacency, because of the stories we hear and the people we support. It's you don't have to have a lived experience to be impacted by this industry on this world, and the risks. Where we all chose, lived experience or not, to enter this field, and we're all vulnerable. Doesn't matter what lives we had before we entered it. I'd say the main difference between someone with lived experience is that whether we're at work or not, suicide is a part of our life and we don't turn it off. So people who've chosen to enter this field, we want to make meaning out of that constant message that's in our lives and turn what is sad and often negative for a lot of people into a completely different meaning. And that's what I choose to do. I do often think about what I've been through because it's very much part of my life and I'm never going to be able to remove it. I tried, it didn't happen. So for me, like I go to work, I do hold a lot of really sad stories and I sit with people who are bereaved, and sometimes I sit with people who are bereaved 48 hours after a loss. So it's a lot of very sad, raw emotion that I can sit with. But I would rather do that than silence what I've lived through. Even that sad, raw emotion, it fills my cup, because I know for like a tiny, tiny little part, I have hopefully made that sad, raw emotion a little bit easier to hold for that person. And that completely mitigates what I'm holding that might weigh me down at work. And I think it's very, very important for non-lived experience people to realize that it took us a lot to realize we could do this. We did a lot of work to get here. We learned a lot of lessons, some good, some bad, to get to a position where we were able to even talk about what we've been through, to be willing to expose ourselves constantly about what we've been through. Sometimes we don't want to, but it's part of our lives now. And to really challenge ourselves to take some awful events and reverse the messaging for us personally, to be able to do this work. And if we can do that, there's not a lot to worry about with us. Like, understand, like, particularly workplaces, they're very responsible for their employees and highly, highly appreciated. The one thing that I think we could do a little bit better is, instead of making decisions for us, make decisions with us, because we know what we're capable of.
Yeah, I really connect with that, Hope. Particularly your points around, well, everybody's carrying around something, and that we're just, we label ours, and we put our hand up and say, hey, this is my experience. And it's something that's coming through in these chats. A lot of people do work in suicide prevention while actively experiencing suicide, whether that's, in your case, a loss, or their own internal suicidality, or caring for somebody. And it provides a purpose and a meaning, and gives that hope that needs to be there to continue to live and be productive or contribute. Like, that risk aversion conversation really needs to be had in this space, because it's happening. We're just not open about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really connect with that. But is there anything that we haven't kind of talked about that you wanted to get out publicly, before we wrap up?
Look, I just want to say that I I feel really grateful to be able to do this work. Um, I I personally am fairly new to the industry, so I've been working in sort of this field for about 18 months. And prior to doing this, I was a retail manager, so a little different. And you know, this work is hard, so hard. But I often think, where would I be today if I was working in that field when my brother died? Because you can't say to your customers, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not giving you good service today. I'm dealing with a bereavement of suicide. Like, you just wouldn't get the sale. Let alone, you'd probably have to do a lot of conversations with your EPA. But I every day I wake up and I know I'm going to have really raw, difficult conversations with people. Like, I will get notifications of people dying by suicide in my inbox, and like, I open that and every morning I'm like, oh, here we go. Like, why am I doing this? I don't think I've ever had a moment where I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? This isn't a good idea. And like, like before I entered, I didn't even really understand the concept of lived experience. I was kind of, I think I very much buried my head in the sand about what my life was like. And like I feel really, really grateful and honored that I have the ability to really explore what this lived experience world looks like. And not only do I have this pretty cool job, like it is a pretty cool job. I couldn't think of anything that could help society more than sitting with bereaved people, talking to people about what bereavement looks like, understanding how people can really navigate this new part of their life and, like, in some tiny way, be able to make that path a little less rocky for them. And I just want people to understand that that is okay. We are okay. We're going to be okay. There's, just because we've had a lot of challenges in our life, again, we're not unique. People have challenges. We're just lucky that we can talk about them. And we can use them for a positive outcome, sometimes not a positive outcome as well. Like, we're not all happy stories. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not 100% certain the point I'm trying to make. But I'm really, really, I'm happy to and grateful to be part of this conversation. I think people with lived experience, I mean, before it was identified as lived experience, people with non-identified lived experience were in this field, absolutely making many differences. And the main difference between us and those people is that we're making differences whilst saying this is the reason why. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. We're also okay with our choices. And if a point down the track comes where we choose to not be okay with that choice, that's also our choice to make. It's no one else's.
Yeah, and I want to jump back. I'm going to continue the conversation. I want to jump back to what you started just before with how difficult it is to work in this space and get up and find a notification that someone had died by suicide in your inbox, and that's really challenging. And often in the sector, it comes across a little bit patronizing, and we say, oh, what are your self-care strategies? How do you keep yourself well? But I want to ask you, what is it that protects you emotionally? What is it in your work that does keep you well?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I've been thinking a lot about that recently, because I don't, like, we talk about self-care a lot, and I recently realized that I don't have like a overt self-care plan. Like, occasionally I might get a massage, but it's not something that I schedule as specific self-care. And look, it might sound wild to say this, but for me, I think knowing that we're starting to form a world that's very different to the one I lived in really sustains me and helps my wellness. So my first major suicide bereavement was 8 years ago, and it was my father. And I did the funeral stuff, stayed at home with my mum for a week, came back to where I live. So this was about 6 hours away. Came back to where I live. I didn't tell a lot of people how he died, and then just went and lived my life. Now, that didn't happen very well. And it took me many, many years to sort of realize that there was a lot of stuff I needed to deal with. But that's okay. I think for me, when I get those notifications, the thing that really sustains me is knowing that those people don't have to do that. We now live in a world where they can talk about what they've been through if they choose to. But even if they don't choose to talk about it, like there are a lot of people we support who, you know, we support them on the deal, and that is okay. That is okay. You know, we're creating a world like in the greater suicide prevention community where there are so many amazing groups and so many amazing people who are really challenging the traditional ways and creating things and environments where people don't necessarily have to suffer in silence, and things for a lot of people, specifically in bereavement, are just getting better for them. And that's what gets me through, because the silence around the death of, like, specifically my father and how different it has been for me since my brother passed away, like night and day, and like that, it's just, that gets me through. Yeah. Which is wild. It's not self-care at all.
Well, it sort of is. Like, I see it as taking away the responsibility of self-care from an individual action, more to taking it to that community level and saying, hey, we all have a responsibility to look out for each other. And it shouldn't just be up to that person to go and get a massage or take a bath. You know, we have a responsibility to support each other. So no, it is self-care in my eyes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and like the self-care conversation, I do think we need to go deeper with what self-care can look like. Like for some people, it is perfectly okay if it's a massage, a walk, yoga. Like, I'm not at all dissing that. If that works, that's amazing. But I think it is also important to acknowledge that helping make change, providing meaning, seeing a difference in someone's demeanor because you sit with them and you say, I'm so sorry, this is awful, and carrying space with them. Like, you can often tell for someone going, oh, I don't have to explain myself, thank God. For me, that really sustains me. Like, that kind of stuff fills my cup. I can't change what someone's been through, but I can change how it might look. And that really gets me through.
And that's a really great place to leave this conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Hope. Thank you so much for being part of this campaign.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this discussion.
And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed Hope's story. I certainly enjoyed having a chat with her, and I look forward to catching up with you for another More Than Just Storytellers video soon.